I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. This was supposed to be my day off, but then last night happened. And by last night, I mean the Israeli strike on Iran. So I knew that I would have to release an episode on what has transpired, and luckily I was able to get friend of the show and very clear-eyed analyst of the Middle East, James M. Dorsey, on the show short notice. James runs the invaluable Substack, The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey, and we're going to be talking about a number of issues, mainly the Israeli strike in Iran, but also the internal divisions in MAGA over Iran, as well as internal divisions in the Israeli political scene, all that and much more in the conversation to follow. This moment that we are in with the Israeli strike on Iran that transpired last night is, in James's view, a paradigm shift. So give this episode a listen, and as always, if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, let's get right to it with James Dorsey. Three, two, one. Welcome back to Parallax Views. This is a bit of an emergency episode. I was looking for someone to talk to today about what has happened with the Israeli strike against Iran, and I immediately thought I need to get James Dorsey on from the Turbulent World with James Dorsey blog. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Uh, I mean, this is a crazy moment we're in right now, and I feel like I'm going to be covering this all for the next few days. So I feel like it's going to be busy lately. I'm sure it'll be busy for you
I have
too.
no doubt.
But
I have
I'm
no doubt. We all will.
I'm curious. A lot of the talk I see right now in America is, especially online, and I probably shouldn't focus on the social media stuff, is whether Trump wanted this to happen, or whether he knew it was going to happen, or whether he's mad at Israel but trying to save face. Do you think those are the wrong questions to ask at this point? What do you think the real question is? Because you're outside that
Well,
American bubble. I think you would know, what's the important question to be asking right now about what has transpired in the past few hours.
maybe it's all true. You never know. Essentially, Trump changes his position. You don't know whether he approved of this. He sort of hinted that he did. He clearly had advance warning. Uh, the evacuation of non-essential personnel from the embassy in Baghdad, and the offer to other embassies to evacuate their non um, essential personnel if they wanted to. His latest social media posting, in which he basically said to Iran, "It's going to get worse if you don't bend." Uh, so it's unclear. It's unclear whether he knew. I think
Well, I
one,
think I think a few
whatever.
days ago he was sort of saying like, don't. I think he was saying publicly and privately from the reporting I've seen that he didn't want Israel to attack Iran, but like you said, he can just change at a drop of a hat.
Also, I think that even if he, on Monday, when he had his phone call with with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he may very well have said to Netanyahu, or let me put it differently, Netanyahu may very well have informed him of Israeli plans. He may very well have said to Netanyahu, "Don't do it." But the problem here is that even if he said, "Don't do it," but didn't add that there would be consequences if Israel went against his wishes, Netanyahu would have seen that as a tacit green light, or in any case, as an opportunity to strike with very little consequence from Trump. And that complicates things for Trump because clearly, if he knew in advance of this and did not go out of his way to stop it, the Iranians are going to perceive him as having been a culprit.
How do you see Iran responding to this? I mean, this is a major escalation.
Well, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Iran has to respond. And it's going to be difficult for Iran. Uh, if it responds as it did last year, which really were when it launched two missile barrages at Israel, those were very calculated, calibrated barrages that weren't designed to hurt Israel, but they were designed to say we can respond and we can hurt you. This time round, as a matter of principle, Iran has to hurt Israel. And if it opts, which is not impossible, for another calibrated, restrained response, it risks being seen as weak, because this is an issue on which probably, or one of the few issues on which probably the regime in Tehran has a significant degree of popular support. Now, how Iran responds, the most likely response is a barrage of missiles and drones. This time, probably using missiles that it didn't use, higher end missiles that it didn't use last year in the two barrages. It obviously has the option to strike at U.S. bases. I think the glass is half full and half empty on whether or not it would choose to strike U.S. bases in countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. You could argue on the one hand that it may not want to do so because it wants to maintain its relations with those countries, and because those countries didn't necessarily want to see Israel strike. But on the other hand, you could also argue that if they do strike at a U.S. base in the kingdom or in the Emirates, that may be a way of increasing pressure on the United States to come to some agreement with Iran. And then, of course, the third option that Iran has is asymmetric warfare, which would include assassinations, much like Israel has done, um, or attacks in third countries. Now, one of the problems that Iran also has in deciding how it's going to respond is that this is a deep embarrassment to Iran. It signifies the degree to which Israel has penetrated Iran. It also confirms Israel's assertion that last year it took out, to a large degree, Iranian air defenses, and that Iran has not been able to close that gap in the past year.
Can you talk a little bit about how Iran has acted, maybe in, say, like the last 18 months, or how they've responded to various relations with the US and Israel? Because I know a lot of people say they've been relatively restrained. Do you think that's the case? And have they made some bad moves, I guess, in the past 2 years or so?
Well, look, the problem, okay, this is a problem on both sides, if you wish. Iran is not, if Israel is its own worst enemy, so is Iran. The rhetoric that it uses, the language that it uses, the imagery that it uses is not very conducive to garner empathy for Iran, and raises questions about what Iran's intent is. Um, I don't think that Iran was operationally involved in the October 7, 2023 attack by Hamas on Israel. I don't think that in the last 18 months, support for Hamas, at least support for Hamas in Gaza, was anything but symbolic. Essentially, the strip is sealed off by the Israelis. So the opportunity to get weapons into the, or money for that matter, into the strip would have been minimal. It clearly did support the Houthis. It supported the pro-Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq. But I don't think that I think that its support in terms of action against Israel during the Gaza war was restrained. And of course, Iran has suffered significant setbacks. It suffered the Israeli attacks, which did real damage to Iran.
Well, that's more what
It
I was
suffered
trying to get at, by the way, was I think their responses to attacks or have been more restrained than they could have been.
oh, absolutely, they have been. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that Iran has suffered serious setbacks. Hezbollah has been severely weakened, ultimately will be moved out of southern Lebanon. Bashar al-Assad fell, and it has a difficult relationship with the new government in Damascus, and Syria as an element of the axis of resistance and a conduit for weapons and funding from Iran to Hezbollah has been eliminated.
In a sense, Iran is
It's really
isolated.
sorry.
In
I,
a sense, Iran is
I don't
isolated.
I don't know how isolated it is. It's weakened.
Okay.
It's. I think you've got to keep in mind, and that goes also to something else which we should talk about, and that is what does an all-out war mean? Um, it's been weakened. Its relations with the Gulf have been maintained. Its relations with multiple other countries. Its isolation is first and foremost in the West. So I'd be careful with using the word isolated.
What do you think the most important? I asked this at the beginning, but I sort of couched it in a sort of like, well, what do you think of all the American sort of speculation right now? But putting aside America, putting aside um, Trump's response, what do you think the most important questions we should be asking right now are in regards to what has transpired and what could transpire?
Look, I think there's a fundamental problem, and the fundamental problem is that the way Trump approaches the negotiations is this is what you're going to do, and this is what I'm telling you you're going to do, and it's really going to get bad if you don't do it.
Right. He's basically saying you are not going to have an
That
enrichment program.
that's the tone. That's a tone and language which is it does not go down well with the Iranians. It's also a tone and language that doesn't inspire confidence, particularly in a president who unilaterally walked away from an agreement that Iran was abiding by. Now, I think part of the enrichment problem is that Trump needs to come up with an agreement that is substantially different from the 2015 international agreement that curbed the Iranian nuclear program because he walked away unilaterally from it. And if he comes up with basically what is just an updated version of that agreement, the question arises, why did you create this mess in the first place?
Is there anything you think people like myself, maybe, or U.S. pundits or commentators, or even people covering this news may be missing in all of this?
Well, I think the negotiating strategy is something that is gone missing in debate in the United States. And I think it's very important. Uh,
You mean
the
the sort of
Iranians made
strong
very
arm
clear
nature of how Trump approaches it?
the strong arm nature, basically. I'm going to get my way by hook or by crook. We can take the high road, but we can also take the low road. And that's not a conducive negotiation strategy. Iran has a right to enrichment within certain parameters, and I think you've got to keep in mind or remember Iran abided by the 2015 agreement. When Trump withdrew in 2018, Iran waited a year before it gradually started to no longer abide by the terms of that agreement. It didn't abandon abiding by the terms of the agreement because it then had decided we're going for a nuclear weapon, it progressively did that and gradually did that as a form of leverage, wanting to get the United States back to the table. It obviously didn't. Now, there's an important aspect here. Part of the problem with the Biden administration was that they did not want to simply go back to the agreement from which the United States had unilaterally withdrawn. They wanted to raise and include other issues, which Iran never was willing to include in nuclear negotiations, but kept the door open to negotiating those issues, ballistic missiles, non-state allies, if and when you had an agreement. Uh, you've got to understand what this is about. What this is about is Iran's defense strategy. You know, it doesn't have borders with its enemies. It does not have a border with Israel. It obviously doesn't have a border with the United States, which means that if there is an all-out regional conflict, this is not going to be a land conflict, because the only way to have a land conflict would be that one of the two parties is capable of invading the other, bringing in troops and assets by air or sea. Iran's not capable of doing that in terms of Israel. Israel may or may not be capable of that. It would be a very difficult enterprise, but clearly doesn't want to get involved in this. So we're looking at an air and missile battle, potentially a battle of asymmetric warfare. Again, Israel, that was demonstrated today. Israel is the militarily dominant party. It has an air force, a very sophisticated air force. It has battle-hardened pilots. Iran doesn't have an air force for all practical matters. It doesn't have a navy for all practical matters. It has a bunch of speedboats and a larger vessel here and there. So, Iran's going to this is going to prompt very difficult calculations for the Iranians.
When you say Israel clearly doesn't want this, you mean they clearly don't, they don't want to, or they can't put like boots on the ground.
They don't want to. Look, this is a country of 10 million, including the Palestinians, invading a country of 80 or 80, 90 million. It's this, don't, as weak as Iran may be, and as many disadvantages as it may have, this is a formidable country.
What do you think this means for the Islamic Republic going forward? I see a lot of people saying this is the end. I'm not sure that it is.
I would be cautious with that. It's a serious blow, and it the regime's survival to some degree could be at stake. There'll be a fallout from this, but Iranians are also nationalists, and they're proud nationalists. And many Iranians, irrespective of what they think of the regime, believe that Iran has a right to enrichment within the parameters of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the rules and regulations of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So, yeah, this is a crisis for the regime. There's no doubt about it. But let's face it, this is a regime that's been in crisis for the last 46 years.
If you can go a few more minutes, do you think that gets overlooked when it comes to talking about the Iranian people? I see some people saying, well, if there's an all-out war, we'll be liberating the Iranians from the Islamic Republic oppressors. And I think there's this assumption that, a war with Iran will be greeted as like Liberation Day by Iranians. And I'm not so sure that's the case either, even if they dislike the regime in Tehran.
Ultimately, if Iranians want to be liberated, they have to liberate themselves. It's not for others to liberate them. if a movement
Well, it's
were to
kind of
emerge,
colonial logic to say, oh, we're going to be the liberators. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Um, I think that this is not a popular regime by any stretch of the imagination. Let's be clear about it. Also, implicit in the notion of liberating Iran, that, yeah, gee, you overthrow this regime and you're going to get a flourishing democracy. You may not. And the successor regime may not be a democratic regime. It could be the Revolutionary Guards. It could be the military. It could be any combination of things. I think there's a lot of parroting of what is a very substantial Iranian diaspora that has its own views, which don't necessarily coincide with uh, trends and thinking inside Iran itself.
I don't know if this is even a worthwhile question to ask, but I'm going to run it by you. Um, I see a lot of sort of ideological combat going on, not just today, but in the past, I would say 2 or 3 weeks between elements of MAGA or the Trump base. You have one side that really does not want a war with Iran, the sort of grassroots, like people that write for outlets like the American Conservative. And then on the other hand, you have people like Mark Levin who are very gung ho about, they're very hawkish on Iran. Do you think that the sort of ideological divides in MAGA are going to affect how Trump responds to this, or is it significant in any way? I guess is what I'm asking.
I think that you've seen from early on in this administration a rivalry between the Make America Great Again crowd, which basically does not think that US and Israeli interests coincide or overlap at all times, and a pro Israeli crowd. The Iran hawks are part of the Iranian pro Israeli crowd. On balance, what you've seen, I think, is that the pro Israeli crowd has suffered a significant number of setbacks. The Iran negotiations were one. The truth with the Houthis were another one. The replacement of Mike Waltz and the firing of a number of National Security Council um, operatives was another setback. The direct talks between the United States, between the Trump administration and Hamas was a setback. You've seen, on the other hand, actually last week or this week, the appointment of two pro-Israel figures to prominent positions in Homeland Security and in the Defense Department, two people who were writing fellows at the Middle East Forum in Philadelphia, which is a pro-Israel hardline advocacy outfit. Um, but on balance, Trump has come down in all of these issues so far on the Make America Great Again side.
Yeah, the Make America Great Again or America First sort of side of things. In terms of that, do, what do you think this means for both that pro-Israel side of the Trump base and the sort of America First side?
But I think, as a matter of principle, the pro-Israel side is on the defensive. Now, that is not to say that Trump does not see common interests with the Israelis. He wants to see Hamas destroyed. He basically was the legitimizer of far right Israeli thinking when he came out with the proposal for a high-end, resettlement of all the Palestinians elsewhere in Gaza, and turning Gaza into a high-end luxury real estate development. That allowed Netanyahu to make ethnic cleansing a war goal and an Israeli government policy. Um, I also think that the Trump administration is moving away from the notion of a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that obviously Netanyahu embraces and the far right in Israel embraces. Um, so I think it's a mixed bag.
Do you think I see some people jumping on this sort of, I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, but I mean it's definitely speculative that Israel did these strikes when they did them to blow up the negotiations. Would you caution against people jumping to that line of thought, or?
Well, I have no doubt that Netanyahu had multiple goals with this. One was disrupting the negotiations, even though they were at a stalemate prior to the Israeli attack on Lebanon on Iran. But clearly, Netanyahu does not believe in negotiations, has been advocating military action for a long time, and saw the opportunity to do it. It also puts for now, the Palestinian issue on the back burner, and to the degree that the people like Witkoff and others being optimistic that they were close to an agreement. Obviously, this blows it up, at least for the time being. Um, and you have an issue now which is not divisive in Israel, but in which Israelis are rallying the wagon behind these attacks.
Before closing out, in terms of Israel-Palestine, how significant do you think it is that we're seeing figures like Olmert and Golan? I think they've both openly called what's happening in Gaza less a defensive war, and now they're saying this has become a war of annihilation. Do you think that's a significant change in Israel?
I think it's significant. I mean, look, these are former prime ministers who are saying this, and it's remarkable. But now, to be fair, uh, both Olmert and Barak offered the Palestinians uh, terms for an agreement when they were in office that were among the most liberal terms. They fell short in lots of ways of what Palestinian aspirations are, but nonetheless, they were the most far-reaching proposals Israel put on the table.
And by the
Uh,
way, I think they're
but
both saying the war of annihilation thing is being, they're saying it critically, like they're being critical of Netanyahu's approach.
absolutely, absolutely, they, but I, I would be careful in concluding from that here are the guys who want an independent Palestinian state.
Right. No, I agree.
Uh,
Mhm.
but that doesn't make it within the Israeli context less significant.
So, what do you think Golan and Olmert are getting at when they criticize the Netanyahu approach? Because I think they see this as maybe damaging to Israel long term.
Look, I think that they definitely see the damage that Israel has done to itself, which is going to be very difficult to repair. They recognize that there has to be some sort of resolution of the Palestinian issue, and that resolution can't be ethnic cleansing or mass murder. That there has to be a compromise. That's, I think, what drives them.
Do you think there's also a fear on that side of Israeli politics of the sort of religious Zionists? Because I've talked to settler types, and they don't just hate Palestinians; they have a lot of contempt for liberals as well. And like in a way, they're next on those liberals are sort of next on the chopping block.
Well, there's okay. Um, One of Israel's issues, as far as I'm concerned, is the rise of an ultra nationalist religious far right. They run uh, a series of pre-military academies. One of the foremost academies is an academy called Ben David. There's a rabbi who's an instructor at that academy who painted on the wall of the academy, and I'm paraphrasing this, but the last part of this quote is absolutely accurate, which is secular Jews put a bullet through their head. So yes, but in some ways, okay, I think one thing to understand is that Netanyahu comes from a faction within the Zionist movement, which was far right in many ways, but was also, in my mind, the intellectually most honest of the Zionist faction.
Do you mean
So,
the like sort of Jabotinsky sort
well,
of?
the ideologue, Zev Jabotinsky, who was a very erudite poet, politician, writer, playwright, and frankly, Moshe Dayan, even though he was not on the far right, he was part of the labor movement, but he had that intellectual honesty.
But
And the
both of I
intellectual
think
honesty,
both of them, not to interrupt you, but I think both of them said like, well, the Palestinians have a right to be angry with us. Yeah.
both of them said, and again paraphrased, uh, there are different views of ways of viewing this, and Palestinians view this differently, and that's legitimate. Now, the conclusion that they drew from that, Jabotinsky's conclusion was, it's us or them in this swath of land, and it's going to be us. There's not room for two. Dayan basically said, yeah, they have a point from their point of view, and that means that we will live by the sword, and that we have to be willing to do so.
How significant do you
Which
think it is that the sort of ideological predecessors to Netanyahu, like Jabotinsky, um, were secular ultimately, rather than the ultra religious types?
I think it's significant, and uh, but if you really look at it, okay, or you look at Netanyahu's cabinet, there are within that realm, if you wish, there are two categories. There are the ultra nationalists who may be religious themselves, but they're ultimately ultra nationalists. So, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, and then you have the ultra conservatives or the ultra orthodox, whichever way you want to call them, who for whom religion plays a much greater role than the nationalist aspect.
Last thing, I promise we'll close out after this because you've been very generous with
No
your time
worries.
already. I want to go back to this because I know some of my listeners are like really interested and obsessed with it. But this idea that Trump may have told Netanyahu earlier this week, do not attack, do not do a strike, and then Netanyahu does it anyways. In a way, that would be like Netanyahu calling Trump's bluff. Like, well, what are you going to do about it? If that is what has happened here, what do you think the significance of that is? The sort of idea that
Well, that's
Netanyahu
one way of
called the
looking
bluff.
at it.
Okay.
That's one way of looking at it. I mean, Trump has publicly said, don't do it. It's not just a reported position. He said it. The point here is that saying that to Netanyahu is not enough. In other words, Trump should know that simply saying to Netanyahu, don't do it, and Netanyahu will fall in line, is a gamble. Saying to Netanyahu, look, don't do it. And if you do it, I'm going to, that's going to have consequences.
What would those consequences be, though? Like that,
That
someone
could
said that to me
be,
today. What can he actually do? Yeah.
well, look, he could do multiple things. He could not supply weapons or not supply certain weapons to Israel. He could withdraw political support for Netanyahu. He could show up at next week's conference in New York, the French-Saudi conference on a Palestinian state. Uh, there are all kinds of things he could do. Now, he has to balance what he can do, obviously, with his own base, parts of which would are very supportive of Israel. So for him, it's a balancing act too. But nonetheless, he does have options, or he would have had options if he had wished to exercise them.
If that is the case, then that Netanyahu called a bluff here, does that make Trump look weak? And, will that have ramifications?
Well, again, I mean, I can't read Trump's mind, and I don't know many people who can.
Well, that's fair. And I'm sorry if I'm
So
circling the wagon with these questions,
no,
but
no, 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 no problem. So, in other words, with I think if you look at what Trump has been saying in recent days, prior to the Israeli attacks, he clearly was becoming frustrated with Iran. He clearly was trying to step up the pressure. He um, may have seen an Israeli attack as a way of increasing the pressure. I think it's a fallacy. I think you're going to see Iran hardening rather than becoming more flexible
well,
as a
that's really
result
important.
of this.
Why do you think it's a fallacy?
Because the Iranian look, Trump and Iran and the Iranians are basically actors acting out the same role again and again and again. You know, and so the Iranians are reacting to what happened today the way they've always reacted to what happened to things like that happened granted on a more limited scale, but nonetheless. And and to to push this forward, both parties would have to be bold and start breaking these patterns and rethinking how they approach each other. Now, that's not what we're seeing happening.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that? Like would you say that there's past examples of how Trump and Iran have interacted, like with say Soleimani's assassination, that you would compare and contrast to what's happening now?
Uh, I mean, this is far more serious than
No, no, I understand
Soleimani's
that. Yeah. But you're
assassination.
saying there's
But
sort of a cycle.
I
Yeah.
look. I think you look at least the last Truth Social posting by Trump that I saw, in which he basically said, "Look, this is going to get worse. This is going to take days. I want to save Iran." Uh, in other words, what he's saying is, "Bend to my will, and you'll come out of this okay. If you don't bend to my will, this is just going to get worse."
And you're saying
And
that's
you
the
see Iran's
strategy he's always gone with.
and
Yeah.
you right, and you see Iran's reaction. Uh, you know, Khamenei using basically foul language, saying that we're going to teach them a lesson.
So they're sort of caught in this never-ending cycle of
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a vicious circle.
anything else you want to add in closing that I missed, and let my listeners know how they can keep up with your work. I highly recommend that my listeners support your Substack if they can financially. But is there anything else you want to say in closing?
I think we've covered it mostly. We're clearly at this is a paradigm shift. There's no doubt about it. It
Do you think
is
it's a
not
scary moment?
necessarily
Because I'm very worried that this could turn into all-out war. Or am I being too alarmist?
well. Again, it it could yes, it could turn out to all-out war in the sense that you're going to see enhanced Israeli strikes. Um, I wouldn't want I wouldn't put it past the Israelis if this escalates to turning this into a regime change operation. Um, I think that there is the risk of other parties getting involved, which basically means that it risks riding roughshod over multiple plans. Gulf plans to diversify their economies, to focus on economic growth. Um, the the fruits of the Trump visit to the Gulf in May, all of that could be in play now. So this is by any definition a very dangerous moment.
That's the other thing I was going to add since you said we've covered most of it. What must the Gulf states be thinking? I'm curious what you think Turkey may be thinking about this. I know we can't read minds, but I'm assuming the Gulf states are not like necessarily viewing this as like the greatest development.
Well, I mean, I think the Gulf states and certainly Saudi Arabia made that very clear in its statement on the Israeli attacks. We're in a very different Middle East uh, compared to where we were when the nuclear agreement was signed in 2015,
Is it
and
more
even when
fragile?
Trump, much more fragile at the time. At the time, the Gulf states really wanted they were focused on. Or let me put it differently: Iran was a major issue for them. It still is a major issue for them today, but in a very different way. They weren't so much focused on the nuclear program. They were much more concerned about the ballistic missiles, about the non-state actors, but the focus of their policy was to defend and protect themselves against Iran. Today, these are countries that have engaged with Iran and believe that engagement is the way forward and the way to reduce the Iranian threat. This is a situation in which the Iranian threat looms very large again. That's not what they wanted.
I also asked about Turkey, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that. And if I could, Syria, how will they be looking at this, especially with the new leadership in Syria?
Well, I don't think that the Turks want to see an Israeli-Iranian war from largely the same reasons that the Gulf doesn't want to see it. This is very disruptive. It's not where the Turks wanted to go. The Syrians, again, this is a different Syria. This is no longer a Syria that's aligned with Iran. This is a Syria that has gotten Trump's endorsement with the assistance of the Saudis. It's a Syria that has issues with Israel, but wants a negotiated solution to those issues, and ultimately uh, would probably be willing, if those issues are resolved, and those are basically occupation issues, including the Golan Heights, but also territory that Israel has occupied since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. But by the way, what you're seeing in terms of Israeli policy towards Syria or or towards Iran is you've seen a smaller version of that in Syria. With other words, Israeli strategy today has become one in which it wants to, if not demilitarize those states in the region that it views as threats, it certainly wants to significantly weaken their military capabilities. So, what Israel did from day one after the fall of Bashar al Assad in Syria was decimate the Syrian military. Hundreds and hundreds of airstrikes against Syrian military facilities, weapons arsenals, and so on. Exactly what you're seeing now in Iran.
Do you think there's a problem with when talking about the U.S., Iran, and Israel? The impression I get from you, and maybe I'm misreading this because I tend to think it's like the great crime of nations, but I feel like there's a lot of hubris to go around, and I think hubris ends up being the downfall of a lot of different actors. Is there a lot of hubris that is preventing possible solutions or resolutions to issues?
Without question.
Okay.
Now, in Israel's case, let's be clear about it. militarily, the Israelis are very successful. They were very successful in Lebanon in terms of decimating Hezbollah. They today's strikes at Iran were brilliant. There's no question about it. There are people who argue, well, they didn't succeed militarily in Gaza, and that's true. But it's partly true not because Israel didn't have the capability, but because Israel was not so far willing to do what it would take. What it would take in Gaza is reoccupy the territory from north to south and administer it. And that's something that Israel doesn't want to do. And as a result, that puts limitations on what it can do militarily. Israel's problem is that it is militarily, as a matter of principle, successful, but it is incapable of translating those successes into political successes. In a sense, it's the flip side, or it's a continuation. Go back to the 1973 war. Israel in 1973 was able to turn the tables militarily, but couldn't translate that politically.
And I think you've said all that you've said already about hubris on the American and the Iranian end, right?
Right. No,
Okay.
I think it's hubris, and there's any amount of hubris to go round.
Well, hey, James Dorsey, I want to thank you for coming on Parallax Views. Plug the Substack, the Turbulent World, real quick.
Go to jamesmdorsey.substack.com. It's my at least twice, if not three times weekly column. If you can afford it and are interested, it's what allows me to keep the column going, and at least cover my expenses of it. And I look forward to any questions and comments that readers, listeners, viewers may have.
I just want to add to that real quick. I really do want my listeners to check out the Turbulent World Substack, because a lot of us can have very strong opinions on what's happening in the Middle East. We can get caught up in sort of ideological takes, and I think you are much more analytical, and you try to just call it as it is, which we need a lot more of. So thank you again for that.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for your support.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Golan, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. if we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.